being improved or something like that. So it took a while for the jets to actually get there. Nevertheless, they did see some lights moving around, and the air traffic controllers on the ground could see a couple of instances where a jet was chasing an object, and the object would suddenly pull off at high speed. This is stuff it's in my book, The Legacy of 1952. This mentions the sightings in Washington, D.C. That was one weekend, the 19th, and the following weekend, there were more radar targets reported. Some people saw objects over the city, and it was a major thing that happened. The first sightings took up some press space in the Washington Post and other newspapers and the Washington Times. And then after the second night of the events, on Saturday night, the 26th or whatever date it was, the press, the whole press was up in arms, because by this time during that week, the Air Force had apparently put out an order to shoot the things down if they don't land, and it was getting to be a rather hairy mess. One of the newspapers, I forget which one, Michigan or someplace, had a 3-inch print type of headline saying hundreds in states see UFOs. And that on that day, on Monday, following that second weekend, General Samford was directed by General Vandenberg, was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and apparently directed Samford, who was the general in charge of intelligence, Air Force intelligence. Samford was told to hold a press conference and basically explain everything, and that's exactly what Samford claimed to do. He started off with a statement that in which he said that credible people were reporting incredible events, and the Air Force was trying to solve these sightings in a rational way. And as far as he was concerned, it was all natural phenomena.
Well,
the press accepted that garbage explanation, and now there was one more specificity, a specific event, case or situation that he was claiming caused the radar targets, was a so-called temperature inversion in the atmosphere, which caused the radar beam to bend. It leaves the antenna going up towards the sky, but if there's a temperature inversion, the beam is bent by refractive index variations. The beam is bent downwards, and it'll hit things on the ground, and you'll think that you're getting some return from something up in the sky, but you're actually getting something on the ground. So anyway, it creates spurious targets if it's bad enough. So he appealed to the radar. He appealed to the atmospheric effects explanation to explain the radar. And in days and years later, calculations were done which showed that there was no temperature inversion that was large enough to cause any effect. The radar guys themselves, who were in the tower at the time, radar controllers, believed that they were seeing real metallic reflection type of things up there moving around in very erratic manners and so on. One case in particular, which is mentioned by the Air Force, was that one of these airplanes coming from Delaware was traveling along at high speed towards Washington, D.C. and saw this target, and they could see on the ground radar the plane approaching the target. The target was going at a high speed. The plane was closing in on it, and then all of a sudden it took off, and the pilot, they could see the thing just outrun the aircraft, and the pilot made some comment that they heard saying that it left at an amazing rate of speed, or whatever his words were. Point being that these things were seen from the ground, from the air, on radar. Something really was going on, and the general managed to cover it all up. He had help from what I call the self-cover-up that's been going along all along. This is a subject that most people don't want to know is real, so they tend to ignore it. Cover yourself up, so to speak. Pay little attention to it or no attention. And the self-cover-up combined with the reluctance of the press to endorse anything that is weird like that meant that the general essentially shut down the subject for discussion, and we're still living in the shadow of that event way back in 1952.
I wouldn't doubt it. Now, when did the word swamp gas come out? What scientist came out? It was working for the government. It claimed most of the sightings were... Yeah, Hynek.
By the way, have you watched the UFO shows on TV that they had in the last couple of months?
You know what? I hate to say it. Project Blue Book, I have not been able to watch it because, to me, it seems it's dramatized a little bit too much. And I have mixed feelings about Project Blue Book. Now, Bruce, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I would like to know if I'm wrong. To me, Project Blue Book, because I did a lot of research on it years ago, and to me, it seemed like they were out, trying to debunk more than try to prove that UFOs exist and gathering information. Right.
Well, the question you just asked me about swamp gas leads right into that. There were a bunch of sightings in 1965 and 66 in Hillsdale and Michigan area. And the guy who was the director of Project Blue Book at the time, Hector Quintanilla, called up J. Allen Hynek, who had been the astronomy consultant since 1948. He had started working for the Air Force in 1948, and Hynek is one of the guys that this UFO show is built around, the Project Blue Book show. It's not any... The Hynek in the Project Blue Book show is not the Hynek in real life. That's far from it. But anyway, the real Hynek was called in by Quintanilla, the head of Project Blue Book, to come up with some explanation for the sightings by dozens or maybe hundreds of people in the Hillsdale, Michigan area in March of 1966, I think it was. And so he went there and he interviewed a number of people, and he found out that there was a marshy area not far from where there were a bunch of people watching these faint lights move around in the wooded area. And so he thought, well, he couldn't explain it. I guess he didn't give much of an explanation for the sightings that were away from the swampy area, but when they were near the swampy area, he thought that maybe it could be swamp gas, which is a real phenomenon of methane emitted from. Methane is generated by decaying material under the water, and it bubbles up through the water, and sometimes apparently can ignite and glow, or make a faint glow. I documented situation, so Hynek suggested that maybe they were seeing swamp gas, at least some of them. And the press glommed onto the phrase swamp gas, and Hynek became forever after the swamp gas ufologist. He didn't like that at all, but that's the way it turned out. But that's where the swamp gas came from. That's all swamp gas has been carried right up to the present time now.
Yeah, and it's still used.
When you wondered about Project Blue Book, Project Blue Book was the third project in a row. The first one, there was no project at all from June of 1947 until January of 1948. During that period of time, they were assimilating the fact that there had been sightings starting in June of 1947. There had been sightings all along July, August, September, October, November, December, and they concluded in September of 1947 that they should set up a special project to find out what these things were, because there were pilots that were reporting these, and that gave some level of credibility to the idea that something was flying around. So they started a formal project called Project Sign that began in January of 1948 and ran for a year. During that time, the Project Sign guys studied a couple of hundred sightings carefully, and by the late summer had concluded that there really was something there, and it probably was extraterrestrial. But they went to General Hoyt Vandenberg was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force at the time, and to get permission to publicize this explanation, and he basically told them, "Sorry, wrong answer." He shut down the use of the suggestion that any UFO was interplanetary was the terminology that was used. You have to understand from the point of view of the investigators themselves, the guys who are handling the data. They had a number of possibilities for explanation, like birds, balloons, unusual aircraft that were being developed, balloons, anything that could be up in the air, basically, and of course hoaxes and delusions. So they had a number of possible explanations for any type of sighting that was coming along. And one possible explanation was interplanetary. Well, after they talked to General Vandenberg, they no longer used interplanetary as a possible solution. So they had to squeeze any sighting event had to be squeezed into a misidentification or something like, well, they considered Russian or Chinese, not Chinese, but Russian or Russian research based on advances by the Germans in the Second World War, for example. But they couldn't really believe in the Russians either, because they would say the Russians wouldn't be stupid enough to fly their highly advanced aircraft over the United States. It might crash and we'd get their secrets. We certainly wouldn't do the same thing flying one of our top secret aircraft over Russia.
Well,
but,
we did one.
Nevertheless,
we did
they tried
one
to
time.
shoehorn any sighting into some explanation, and that got them into trouble too. But they changed the name of the project from Sign to Grudge in 1949, and it was Project Grudge until early 1952, when the name became Project Blue Book, and it stayed Blue Book from 52 all the way till it closed off in 1969. After 69, the official Air Force statement was, "We don't pay any attention to UFOs now. We don't study them. If you have a sighting you want to report, take it to a civilian group." And the claim that the Air Force has done nothing with respect to UFOs has stuck until all of a sudden in December of 2017, a year and a half ago, or more. In any case, at that point there was an announcement that, actually the first announcement was made in October of 2017, that the Air Force had, the Navy had supported a study of weird things because the Navy pilots were reporting them. And that brings us up to today, which I mentioned earlier, where the Navy says that they're going to make it possible for Navy pilots to report weird things and not get screwed out of their lives for it. But they weren't going to let any civilians in on the secrets, you might say, because there was be classified material. Classified equipment would be what was detecting these things, modern types of infrared and radar and so on, detecting these objects, and we don't want to make our capabilities in these sensors. We don't want to make the capabilities easy for the Russians or Chinese to understand.
Well, Bruce, I can honestly tell you, Peter Davenport has been on our network quite a few times this past year, and his reportings of people reporting UFO sightings has gone way up the past year than it ever has been. So something is going on more right now, the past year or so, than it has in a lot of years.
Well, that seems to be. There's the possibility of increased events, and there's a possibility of increased reporting of events. In other words, more reports per event. So I don't know whether